And now, from Nashville Public Television's Studio A, celebrating authors, literature, and ideas for more than 3 decades, this is A Word on Words with John Seigenthaler.
Hello, I'm John Seigenthaler. Welcome once again to A Word on Words. My guest today is a familiar face to most of you, Doris Kearns Goodwin. She won the Pulitzer Prize in History for No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She's an acclaimed historian who lectures around the world. She's frequently called upon by the media to analyze presidential issues, and I'm very glad to have my friend back here today. Welcome, Doris.
I am thrilled to be with you, John, absolutely.
How great it is to have you here to talk about Team of Rivals and other great books. Let's just begin. Let me ask you, what is it that draws you to certain personalities? I mean, Lyndon Johnson, Jack Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, now you're into Teddy Roosevelt. There have been so many books by so many authors on all the great presidents, and still you come up and again and again and again give your publisher and your readers a twist that puts you on the bestseller list, wins acclaim, wins awards. What is it? What's the magnet that draws you to one politician and away from another?
And I think for me, it takes me so long to write these books that the most important question at the start is, who do I want to live with for that long period of time? So I don't think I want to live.
Goodwin, your husband.
No, but when I'm writing
I've got
these
a date
things,
with Teddy tonight.
You wake up with them in the morning, you go to bed with them at night. And so there's a reason why so many people are drawn to these same larger-than-life figures, because they're the most interesting in our history, and they lived in dramatic times. But then the scary thing about that is exactly what you said. If you're going to write about them, as opposed to writing about Millard Fillmore, you're going to have to come up with some angle. And that's what takes time. I mean, it really is the hardest part. I mean, it took me 10 years to write the Lincoln book. It took me longer to write the book about Franklin and Eleanor than it took to fight the war that I was writing about.
World War II.
So, exactly. So for Lincoln, it took like 3 years into the research. I was going to do Abe and Mary at first because I had done Franklin and Eleanor. I thought, okay, I have confidence with Franklin and Eleanor. And I realized she couldn't carry the public side of the story the way Eleanor could. And then as I got into the diaries and letters, I realized, oh my God, he's spending even more time with the members of his cabinet than he is with Mary. He's married to them in a certain sense. And then when I realized they were his rivals, I knew I had the story I wanted to tell. But that took 3 years out of the 10 years.
Well, a team of rivals was, was a subject that everybody had flirted with, but nobody had really engaged.
It's so hard to not understand why either, because everybody knew these diaries were out there. Some of them were published, and they all were such an interesting cast of characters. And there'd been one book years ago that had a chapter on each one of the cabinet officers, but nobody had looked at them, coincidentally with Lincoln in the middle during this entire period of time. And I think the reason I gravitated to it too was that it was scary to do Lincoln. Not only because so many books have been done, but he's like the Moby Dick for an historian.
Sure.
And I figured if I could get to know Seward, if I could get to know Chase and Stanton and
Bates.
these various people and Bates, then I would bring something to him so that it could almost be a comparative look. I loved Plutarch's Lives when I was little, those wonderful essays written thousands of years ago where they compared various people. And in the comparison, you learn something. So I figured if I knew my guys, I could look at Lincoln and I'd have maybe a different look at him because I could compare him to these other people.
You know, the remarkable thing was, during the last presidential campaign, we had these debates. We had 7 candidates on the Republican side, 8 on the Democrat. They were all lined up there for these debates. And they were all digging each other and needling each other and harassing each other and insulting each other. And the book was there to tell us, whether it goes to Obama or McCain, each of them is going to have a chance to learn a lesson from Doris Goodwin's book. And lo and behold, Obama read it and acknowledged that he read it. And he's got Biden and Hillary. on his team of rivals.
No, and I think that was deliberate on his part. I mean, somebody asked him after he won the nomination, would you really be willing to put somebody into your inner circle, even if his or her spouse were an occasional pain in the butt?
Yeah, right.
Of course they meant Hillary. And he went right back. He quoted Lincoln. He said, what matters in a time of peril is who are the strongest and most able people in the country. I want them by my side. That's more important than holding grudges from the past. And so it was a deliberate act on his part to try and surround himself with people, not just of different points of view, but strong people who could argue with him and question his assumptions, which I think was a very strong thing to be able to do.
It's amazing to me as I think back on it, and you pointed out so well, they held him in low esteem.
Did they ever? I mean, when he first was elected, first of all, the newspapers didn't even know what his name was. They were calling him Abram for a while instead of Abraham. And he had to write in and said, I think my name is Abram, you know, sort of. And they thought he was a fourth-rate lecturer, that he told dirty stories, that there was no command, no dignity to him. The people who knew him knew differently, which is why it's not like he arose out of never being confident to suddenly being president. In his own circle, that's what we keep forgetting. In Illinois, they knew who he was, especially the people who knew him well knew he was special. So he carried that confidence to Washington, but he had to reestablish himself all over again. And it took a while, but he certainly did.
And the interesting thing is that he puts them in positions that really make a difference. I mean, it's not as if he were Postmaster General taking care of whether the mails, whether the Pony Express is delivered on time. But, you know, you get the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, Attorney General, those four key positions. He puts his enemies around him. I would have loved to have been able to sit in on one of those cabinet meetings. Your book did that.
But, you know, the interesting thing is to worry about whether it really could work in that degree today, because we know about what these cabinet members said about each other. I mean, they didn't like each other either. One would say, he's a traitor, he's lying. One wouldn't come to the cabinet meeting if another one was there. Today, with our cable news, it'd be impossible for that to just be found out about through diaries after the fact. We'd know about it every day, what each person was saying about the other, which makes it harder to contain these kind of emotions today, I think.
You wrote about the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, and you wrote about Lyndon Johnson, the American Dream, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. I didn't know this until I was talking to a mutual friend of ours who told me that before you were an intern in the Johnson administration, you had written a very mean, almost cruel was the way it was described to me. And I tried to find it online, what you said about Lyndon Johnson before.
Oh, it's even more embarrassing, because what happened is when I was chosen as a White House fellow, which was in the spring of '67, we had a big dance at the White House the night we were selected. And President Johnson did dance with me. That wasn't so strange, since there are only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he twirled me around the floor, he said he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. Well, this article came out in the New Republic several days later, and I've been active in the anti-Vietnam War movement.
It came out after you danced
with him. After the dance, after the White House Fellowship, right? So, and the title of the article was How to Remove Lyndon Johnson from Power. I was sure he'd kick me out of the program, which is what he would necessarily, you know him, you know that that's easy for him to do. Instead, he said to somebody, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I ended up working for him in the White House eventually. I didn't get assigned to him right away. I went to work for Willard Wirtz in the Labor Department, who I fell in love with. He was a fabulous mentor. But then as soon as Johnson withdrew from the race, he called me into the White House. He said, you said I should get out and remove myself. I've now removed myself. You have to work for me. So
well,
that
and
was
you
it.
did.
And I did. And then I helped him on his memoirs those last years.
On Vantage Point.
Yes.
That was what it was.
Vantage Point. That's exactly what it was.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
And how much work did you do with him on that?
Well, I just worked
he
on
was
a couple.
on the ranch, huh?
Oh, well, that was the great thing.
And his heart was the attacks and the surgery had occurred.
Well, he had a heart attack very soon after he got into retirement, and the doctors told him that you have to stop smoking, you have to stop drinking, you have to take care of yourself. I think he was wanting to die. He was so sad in those last years on the ranch, so vulnerable, knowing that his legacy had been cut in two. He had done so much, as you know so well. I mean, 3 great civil rights laws, Medicare, aid to education, National Endowment for the Arts, and yet all that was mattering at that time to everybody was Vietnam. So I worked on 2 chapters, which were the fun chapters. One was on Congress, and who could be better than
that's
that?
right.
And the other one was on civil rights. So, but he had full-time people down there working on it round the clock. But I loved the experience. I was teaching at Harvard at the time, so I would come down on weekends, spend vacations, and actually stayed at the ranch a lot of the time. So I got to know him.
And of course, you knew Dick Goodwin, who was working for him. Dick Goodwin, who worked for John F. Kennedy. Dick Goodwin, who gave us the Alliance for Progress, Alianza del Progreso. That's coined by Dick Goodwin,
Right.
your spouse.
And who wrote the great civil rights speeches. I mean, I didn't know him personally at the time. I was in graduate school when Johnson delivered that speech to the joint session of Congress where he said, "We shall overcome," the speech that did produce the Voting Rights Act some weeks later. And I remember sitting there thinking that that was the highlight in some ways of my young school life, to see such a speech and know I'd been involved in the civil rights movement, nothing like you, just marching, going down to Washington in 1963. And so I didn't meet Dick at all then. Not until 1972. He came to Harvard to finish a book. And he got an office right near mine at the little Kennedy Institute, as it was before the Kennedy School of Government. And I, of course, knew he was. And he had heard that I knew Johnson, so he asked me out for dinner, and the rest is history. Took 3 years after that.
When you see your husband, as you will shortly, I hope you will tell him that I recently was talking with Congressman John Lewis, who quoted that speech.
Oh, wow.
And afterward, we talked about it, and John said, do you know that President Johnson said once with Dick Goodwin, who needs Ted Sorensen, the great speechwriter for John F. Kennedy? And I said, yes, I heard that, John. But the whole environment of the White House is something you have invaded again and again and again, and now once again with Teddy Roosevelt. And what's the magnet there?
Well, again, so many books and good books have been written about Teddy Roosevelt. So what I'm doing is 2 different things. I'm doing the progressive period. So essentially what I'm interested in is how did the country become so able to pass legislation for the first time regulating business? How did the country get so excited about social justice and economic justice during this period of time, essentially from 1900 to 1912? But I'm telling it through Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. They were great friends before they ended up running against each other in 1912. They had met in Washington in the 1890s. Their children knew each other. And then he makes Taft his Secretary of War. He then makes Taft the president. He actually runs Taft's campaign, telling everybody in the country that, Taft's a wonderful guy, and giving advice to Taft, saying, don't ever be seen playing golf. It's a dude's game, and the working man won't like it. Taft wins. And then Teddy feels, when he goes off to Africa for a year, giving Taft room, that Taft is not as progressive as he thought. Comes back, runs against him, breaking their friendship. So it's a wonderful human story. But then, in addition to that, what creates the progressive period is the muckraker journalists, your forebears. Yeah. And I love them. They're all at one magazine, McClure's magazine. Sam McClure is a crazy, manic, depressive, brilliant guy. He's got Ida Tarbell, Ray Baker, Lincoln Steffens, Upton Sinclair, and William Allen White. And they expose what's wrong with these institutions. They expose corruption in the cities and the states, Standard Oil and the trusts, railroad abuses.
Ida Tarbell did.
I love Ida Tarbell.
Yeah.
So somehow I've got to get all these people together. And again, it's the hardest thing to get the structure, but it brings an angle to it that hasn't been done like that before.
For those of you just tuning in, I'm talking with Pulitzer Prize winning author and historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, my friend. So many friends you have that you don't know. Your books have made you friends around the world. And we see you so often on television. And until recently, I had missed your obsession, your love affair with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now I know about you and the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they would say, well, why would she write about the Brooklyn Dodgers? So she was born in Brooklyn, so her father loved the Dodgers. It is a story about the Dodgers, but it's more about, I think, how baseball created a community that touched the lives of families, brought people together, kept them together. Your red scorecard, your scorebook, was part of that story. It's sort of a change of pace for you, that book. So the other books are so deeply in politics and government, so deeply embedded in most of your work. Talk about how that change of pace came about.
Well, I don't think I would have done it had it not been for Ken Burns, who did a documentary on the history of baseball. Yeah. And he came to interview me, and I thought I'd be on for 2 minutes, but it turned out my two beloved teams, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Boston Red Sox, these lovable losers, were going to be the central part of his story. So almost everything I told him appeared on the air. And so everywhere I went, it came out, the documentary, at the same time as Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt did. People would come up to me and tell me they had a similar relationship with their father, with a grandfather, with a mother or something. And I realized how deeply embedded some of these relationships were, and that that's really what I was writing about. But I still didn't think of writing it. A publisher came to me and said, why don't you write about this? So it turned out to be about the 50s, about growing up in a neighborhood at a time when the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees are all in New York at the same time, divided loyalties on our block, but more importantly than that, just what that era of the 50s was like. But unlike these other books, it only took like 8 months to write. Oh God, I'd give anything to have that again.
Well, how easily we forget what baseball meant in terms of changing the country. I mean, it was the time of Jackie Robinson.
Absolutely.
It was the time of Don Newcombe. It was the time of Campanella. I mean, Branch Rickey broke
Absolutely.
the racial ice.
And I think people began to see that these people were heroes to them, and it broke down perceptions and prejudices in ways we can't even begin to understand. Even today in the airport, I saw a sign about Jackie Robinson. I mean, it's amazing the impact that he's had.
How do you feel about the transition? I mean, we're just not long beyond the latest World Series, and New York still is producing championship teams. Let's see, the Dodgers, as I recall, won the World Series in 55.
55, and then 55. They abandoned us in 57, 58.
And then bailed out.
Terrible. It was like Walter O'Malley, we used to have this terrible saying in New York, what if you were in a room with Hitler, Stalin, and Walter O'Malley? And what if you had only 2 bullets? What would you do? And the horrible answer was you'd have to get O'Malley so the Dodgers could stay in Brooklyn.
That's right.
But you know, the big difference now from when I was a girl is that in those days, players stayed on the same team all the time. I mean, it wasn't a good thing, and they didn't have free agency, but still, it meant they were loyal to you and you were loyal to them. Now, at the clink of the highest coin, they go somewhere else. So a little kid who falls in love with a player wakes up at spring training to find out he's gone somewhere else. So you don't have that same degree, I think, of loyalty that we had in those old days.
I thought about it in this last series. I mean, one of the great heroes was Johnny Damon.
Right.
He was on the World
Red Sox
Series game with the Red Sox.
I know.
When the Red Sox win it, your Red Sox won it with Damon, and Steinbrenner steals him away, and he does so much. I mean, and if you say the most valuable player this time was Matsui, Hideki Matsui. I mean, he played for the Yomiuri Giants.
Incredible. No, in fact, it was very embarrassing. At one point, I was on Tim Russert's show on Meet the Press on New Year's, and he asked everyone what their New Year resolution was. And it was just at the time when Damon had gone to the Yankees, so I had to admit that what I was trying to resolve was not to hope he would break arms, legs, and ankles because he had left us. When I was in my first confession, which I told in my memoir, I did have to tell the priest that I was wishing various New York Yankees would fall down stoops and fall down the streets so we could win the first World Series. And the priest said to me, how often do you make these horrible wishes? And I had to say, every night when I said my prayers. So he said, listen, I promise you they'll win someday fairly and squarely. Don't wish harm on others to make it happen.
And then he said, ego te absolve. Absolve you.
Luckily, he was a baseball-loving priest.
If you look at how baseball intersects with politics, you know that the politicians understand where the true heart of the people happens to be, because they're all out there throwing out the first pitch every time they're invited to be there.
Which isn't often a good thing to do. I mean, a lot of them get booed at that point, because I think people who are in the sporting arenas don't often like that mixture of partisan politics. But I think when a president goes, however, then there's a sense of excitement. We were at the All-Star game when President Obama came in throughout the first ball, and I heard that he was very nervously trying to make sure that he didn't one-hop it.
That's right.
I remember actually my son Joey, who served in Iraq after he joined the Army after September 11th and won a Bronze Star in Iraq in combat, came home and they let him throw out the first ball at Fenway Park. So the week before he threw it out, he was so nervous. He said he was more nervous than he'd been his entire time in Iraq. And all of his Harvard friends are calling up and said, "You better not one-hop it." And I said to him, "Joey, it doesn't matter. They're going to say you just back from Iraq." He said, "Mom, you don't understand. It's a guy thing." So I think President Obama felt the same way.
Sure. Well, and he said, well, that brings us back to President Obama and his presidency. And having analyzed presidents of the past, from Roosevelt to Johnson, from Teddy Roosevelt to Franklin Roosevelt, to Jack Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, what do you make of this president?
Well, I think you can see pieces of various presidents in him. There's no one president that he resembles completely. I mean, he obviously has developed an enormous love for Abraham Lincoln, and I think there is something about his temperament that at its best resembles that kind of unflappability, serenity that Lincoln had, that willingness to put past grudges beside, willingness to surround himself with his rivals. The kind of cool that he projects sometimes reminds me of JFK. What he doesn't have yet is LBJ's ability to go to that Congress and to just cajole them and charm them and tell them, "You're going to do what I need you to do," and harass them.
And threaten them.
And threaten them. And TR, too, Teddy Roosevelt had a way of being able to, you know, yell at the people in Wall Street that he wanted to change, or whoever it was in big business. He had good, you know, epigrams to talk about them. And Obama's just a more measured person, but at certain times you may need that kind of toughness with Congress and even with the people you're trying to regulate. So.
If you think about the war, and you've had a son there, wears that Silver Star, I'm sure, with great pride. It strikes me that the president may be caught in a trap from which he cannot easily escape. You've written about Lincoln and Roosevelt. All four presidents you've written about had wartime experiences. Obama's had none. How crippling is that in the process of decision making?
Well, I think one of the reasons why he's taking such a long time now to make this decision is that he's aware that he needs to have the opinions of others. I mean, Lincoln had a very minor war experience. In fact, he later teased that, you know, that the only blood he ever saw was from a mosquito bite. And actually, Franklin Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy but hadn't seen war. So I don't think that's the problem, but I think being thrown in to a war that's already underway with very few options left, I'm glad he's taking time to figure out what to do. My son was called back, actually, as a second tour of duty to Afghanistan after he was home for 2 years from Iraq, and he just got back from Afghanistan. So we know firsthand how complicated that place is and how difficult it's going to be to turn it around. And the only way it can be turned around is if it's going to take a long period of time, and does the American people have the patience for that? I mean, I think the real problem with Iraq and Afghanistan was that on September 11th, if we were going to be in war, as long as it turned out we have been in war, you had to mobilize the spirit of the country behind it. And that was never done. These soldiers have been fighting these wars over and over again. That's why they keep going back for two, 3 tours of duty. I mean, the great thing that FDR was able to do in World War II is to make everybody feel they were part of that war. Obviously, there was a draft, which made a huge difference, but still he had the rubber drives and the aluminum drives. The fact we couldn't get armored Humvees over to those kids in Iraq. In World War II, we had 24-hour day working around the clock to get whatever they needed to them. And I think that's been the hardest lesson, I think, that if we're going to stay in Afghanistan and there's going to be a lot more troops going, that somehow it has to become America's responsibility, not simply the soldiers that keep getting sent over there.
We only have a couple of minutes left. Time just flies by when you're with friends. Let's talk just on the way out about Teddy, about the next book. Are there lessons in TR's term in office for Barack Obama?
Well, I think absolutely, because when Obama was elected, we thought it was a transformative election and that it was going to change citizen activism because those young people, minorities, came to the polls. And in order to keep that progressive impulse going, which Teddy Roosevelt was able to do, it was because the country stayed active under his. It had to do with journalism, but even churches, universities, social scientists, they were all talking about how could government relate to business in order to somehow undo that huge gap in income between people in the turning the 20th century, the tenements, and what to do about social justice. It became part of everybody's conversation. If he's going to become the president that people hoped he was when he was first elected, somehow he has to re-energize and get that civic engagement that we saw in the election back, because that's what made that progressive era successful.
And just in that connection, we have to worry, you and I, about the muckrakers. Media is changing.
Right.
Will change more dramatically in the days ahead. Who's to say there are going to be online muckrakers who can capture the spirit and the heart, the concerns of the country?
Indeed, these muckrakers at that time, they were paid for an entire year to do research and then come up with these reports which were really honest and factually based so they could change opinion in the country. And then even when they went on to other journalistic assignments later in life, they looked back on this era, the progressive era, as the happiest time in their life because they felt they were being fulfilled. They were giving voice to the country. And I don't know how many journalists are going to feel that in the future if they don't have the resources to do this kind of work. And it's such an important, well, you know, I mean, journalism is critical to the operation of a democracy.
We've run out of time. It is so great to have you here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with you.
And I'm so happy to have all of you here. I'm John Seigenthaler for A Word on Words. Keep reading.